that talking about what we're going to talk about today makes me feel like a hypocrite. Because any time this subject is approached, I am made aware of my inability. And it doesn't feel right for me to stand up here and say, you all need to do this, when I myself have trouble with it. Last week we talked about generous giving, and today we're going to talk about forgiving. And that's why I feel like a hypocrite. Because I don't have a formula or 10 steps to forgiveness, and it is something that I still struggle with. So if you'll bear with my hypocrisy for a while, instead of telling you all forgive, what I want to share with you today is what I have learned about forgiveness and my journey with it. We have heard it said time and again, it's important to forgive. But it's so much easier not to. And what I have learned in my journey through forgiveness is what forgiveness is, what it isn't, and why it is so important. And that's what we'll be looking at this morning. So to start off, if this sounds like I'm trying to convince you, I am. But it's because I am also trying to convince myself about why forgiveness is so important and why we need to forgive. So why should we forgive? It has been shown through medical studies and other psychological studies that forgiveness holds benefits and unforgiveness holds deficits. Some of these benefits that are granted through forgiveness are physical benefits. Studies have shown that through forgiveness, or by being a more forgiving person, it can lead to less stress, it can lower risk of heart disease, it affects blood pressure, muscle tension, and immune response, and overall improves psychological well-being. By my act of forgiveness, I benefit physically. And it is as if unforgiveness is a physical weight that I carry. The opposite of these benefits is true for unforgiveness, that unforgiveness leads to more stress, to higher risks of heart disease, affects blood pressure, muscle tension, and immune response negatively, and overall hurts psychological well-being. So these are some of the benefits that the secular world has discovered that forgiveness offers, and the deficits that unforgiveness offers. Now, if this is what the secular world has caught onto in terms of forgiveness, what do we as a religious institution say that the benefits of forgiveness are? It has been shown that there are also spiritual benefits and spiritual reasons to forgive. And right at the top of the list, I would put, because Jesus asks me to. We'll get to that a little later and see what Jesus asks of me when he asks me to forgive. But also, forgiveness eventually leads to increased happiness and joy. We'll also talk about that a little later. And there have been other people who said that just forgiving is as if a spiritual weight has been lifted from my soul. And that by forgiving, I feel lighter. I can't explain it, but I just do. So, have I convinced you yet that forgiveness has its benefits and that unforgiveness has its deficits? This is what convinced me that forgiveness is important. is that physically it has benefits and unforgiveness has deficits. And I was convinced spiritually because Jesus asks me to. So if these are the benefits, if these are the deficits, and if this is why it is important, we need to move on to understand what forgiveness is and what forgiveness isn't. So let's start by kind of understanding what forgiveness isn't, because I think we can get tied up in what it is and what it isn't. First of all, I would say forgiveness is not condoning, forgiveness is not accepting, and forgiveness is not excusing what was done to me. It's not saying that what was done to me is okay. It's not saying that what happened was okay. And it is not condoning the action. Some people might say, if I forgive this person, it's like I'm saying that what they did to me was okay. No, that's not what forgiveness is. It's not condoning the action. But it's having the ability to name the offense, to be able to bring it into the light and deal with it head on. Forgiveness isn't condoning. Forgiveness is also not preceded by an apology. If someone wrongs me, and I am waiting for the day that they apologize for me to forgive, that day might never come. And most times it doesn't come. So forgiveness is not preceded by an apology. It is me taking initiative, despite whether I was apologized to or not, saying that even though I believe what was done to me is wrong, I will choose to forgive. Forgiveness is not preceded by an apology. Forgiveness is what I found is also not necessarily forgetting. We've heard the saying before, forgive and forget, right? But it is not necessarily forgetting. What I have found is that forgiveness and forgetting can happen when I have the best relationship with a person. For example, if Linda does something to hurt me, but we have a good relationship, it's easier for me to say, Linda, I forgive you. Let's speak of this no more. Forgetting the offense. But that happens in the very best of relationships. Sometimes the hurt is so grievous and the wound so deep that we want to avoid anything to do with the situations that caused it ever again. And if we forget, then it's easier for us to fall back into the situation, and we will get hurt again. It is important to remember in order that we can avoid further problems in the future. Forgiving is not necessarily forgetting. And finally, what forgiveness isn't, it is not necessarily reconciliation. Forgiveness is on its own aside from reconciliation. I think God would have us eventually come to reconciliation, but sometimes it is not possible. Sometimes it is not helpful. Reconciliation takes two people both understanding that what was done was wrong, and sometimes we don't get that. Reconciliation takes two, but forgiveness just takes one. Forgiveness is a responsibility I have, regardless of whether or not my offender agrees. So forgiveness is not necessarily reconciliation. It is not necessarily forgiving. It is not preceded by an apology, and it is not condoning. I think having these things in mind help me understand what the task of forgiveness is about, and help me better understand what forgiveness is then. So if this is what forgiveness isn't, what forgiveness is? Or what is forgiveness? First of all, I would say that forgiveness is a process. What I found is that when I approached forgiveness and I said, all right, I'm sitting down, I didn't like what this person did, but I forgive them. Move on, I'm done. One and done forgiveness. And I found when this person's name was brought up, when I heard news about this person, when I heard good that was happening to this person, and I still had this anger inside me that I hadn't really forgiven. What I learned is that forgiveness is not one and done. Forgiveness is a process. And because it is a process, it takes time. Forgiveness takes time. Sometimes it might take shorter amounts of time than other offenses that are done, but forgiveness is a process. And as such, it can take time. So forgiveness is a process. Forgiveness is also, what I have found, a refusal to let what someone did or the very thought of this person rob me of my joy. Forgiveness is a refusal to let myself be robbed of joy. You may have heard these sayings about forgiveness or holding grudges or resentment. Something like holding on to resentment or holding on to a grudge is like letting someone live in your head rent-free. Or revenge is like drinking poison and expecting someone else to die. What forgiveness is, then, is the refusal to let that person take up space in my head for free. It is the refusal to let them live there. Forgiveness is an eviction notice for them in my head. Forgiveness is also refusing to drink the poison at all. It's refusing to have this animosity toward the person, pushing the poison aside. It is a refusal to let what someone did, or even the very thought of that person, rob me of my joy. Because in essence, forgiveness isn't necessarily about them. And it's not necessarily for them. It's for me. I forgive because I want to have peace. Because I want to experience joy. Because I want to experience life unfettered. So I choose to forgive. Because it is a refusal to let someone else rob me of my joy. What else I have found about forgiveness is that it is setting free. What I mean by that is some think that through unforgiveness, I'm holding my offender in a cage. And by unforgiving them, I'm not letting them go from what they did. I will not let them go. I will not forget what was done to me. But what forgiveness is setting someone free. It's opening that cage and letting someone out. And what we find, or what I have found, is that when I decide to forgive and set someone free, the person I'm setting free is me. The only one who is locked in the cage when I don't forgive is me. I'm putting the handcuffs on myself. And what I do with forgiveness is realize that I have had the key all along. And that it's my choice to be free. Forgiveness is setting someone free and realizing that the person you set free is you. Because unforgiveness is handcuffing me. What else I have found of what forgiveness to be is that it is passing along what we have received. As I was thinking about this and what this really means, I reflected on all the times I have been forgiven. Just in a relationship between me and God, how often have I been forgiven for the wrongs I have committed against my Lord? In the Psalms we read that He is removed my iniquity from me as far as the east is from the west, throwing my sin into the depths of the sea. I have been forgiven for so much. And even from myself to other people, I have been let off the hook for so much. Through friends and family I have wronged, they have given me forgiveness. And what helped me understand this, passing along what I have received, it helped me when I understood forgiveness as a snorkel. Now, what does a snorkel do? You might think, a snorkel allows me to get air while I'm underwater. But that's not all a snorkel does. A snorkel also allows me to breathe out. Because if all I'm doing is breathing in, I will still suffocate. I need to breathe out. So what unforgiveness is then, it's like putting duct tape over the top of my snorkel. Unforgiveness doesn't let me breathe in, and it doesn't let me breathe out. What forgiveness is passing along what I have received from God and other people. And we read in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 6:14 and 15, after Jesus tells us to pray by saying, "Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors," saying, "For if you forgive others their trespasses, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive others their trespasses, neither will your Father forgive your trespasses." I think my understanding of this passage was wrong. Because to say, oh, I should probably forgive so that God can forgive me because I've done a lot of stuff, is entering into a transactional relationship with God. God, I want something from you, so I'll give something because you say it. No. What forgiveness is experiencing the forgiveness of God, breathing in that forgiveness, and breathing out the same forgiveness to others. Jesus is saying, just as God has forgiven you, I want you to forgive other people as well. Passing along what I have received is what forgiveness is about. It's putting on the snorkel, breathing in and breathing out, and refusing to seal myself off from forgiveness. Because how can I forgive if I don't understand what forgiveness is? If I am not experiencing the forgiveness of God, how can I expect to give it to others? Forgiveness is passing along what we have already received. And what I have also found forgiveness to be is it is entering into a flow. And Peter, if you could come up here for a second. I want to illustrate this with a little demonstration. So, what I found forgiveness to be is if, here, you can take that. Petra does something wrong to me. She gives me this hurt. Petra, how dare you? You know what? I'm going to hold on to this. I'm going to bottle it up. You know what? I'm going to make it bigger, holding on to it and just letting it fester until I have the opportunity to give it back to you. Take it. Take my unforgiveness. Take my revenge. And then what Petra does is she also holds on to it and she compounds it into an even bigger grievance, and unforgiveness abounds and until she gives it back to me and it's even worse than before. And I cannot believe Petra did that to me. I'm going to hold on to this, make it bigger and bigger and bigger until I get the opportunity to send it back to Petra, bigger than what she did to me. And then Petra again gives it back, bigger and probably filled with gross things. What forgiveness, thank you, Petra. If you want to leave, you can. What forgiveness is taking the hurt out of circulation. Forgiveness is admitting that, yes, what was done to me was wrong, but I'm refusing to let it pass on to someone else. It helped me to understand forgiveness as a river. When someone does something wrong to me, I have the choice to take what was done and either hold on to it, let it compound, let it grow, and pass it on to someone else, or drop it, let it flow down the river of forgiveness. What I mean by forgiveness is entering into a flow. It is accepting the forgiveness that God gives me, and it is letting it pass on to other people. It is dropping my hurt, and it is letting it flow down the river of forgiveness. This is what I found forgiveness to be: a process. It is a refusal to let someone steal my joy. It is setting someone free and realizing that the whole time I'm the one who needed to be set free. It is passing along what we have received from God and from others, and it is entering into a river of forgiveness that washes over me wave after wave and letting my hurt flow down the river. That is what I have found forgiveness to be. But I would finalize this list by saying forgiveness. What forgiveness is it is the hardest thing I will ever do. Because forgiveness ultimately is foreign to human experience. If we looked in the story of the Bible, what we would find is that not once in the Old Testament is there a single command for God saying, forgive. Anytime the word forgive is used in the Old Testament, the verb forgiveness is an action taken by God. We will remember verses like, I will forgive their transgressions. I will carry their burdens. I will forgive their iniquities. Forgiveness is so foreign to human experience that God had to take on the responsibility and set the precedent for forgiveness. And Jesus comes on the scene saying, you have heard it said, love your neighbor, but hate your enemy. But I say, love your enemy. Pray for those who persecute you. Forgive, just as you have been forgiven. Throughout your whole history, God has taken on the action of forgiveness. And what Jesus is asking me to do is to pass on what I have received. If I were to list all that I've been forgiven for, I would run out of paper. Jesus is asking me to do the same. Whatever offense is done to me, make it a redemptive response that you employ and forgive. As we have seen, forgiveness has its benefits. We have learned what forgiveness is and what it isn't. And what I would close by saying today is that forgiveness is ultimately a thing of God. Forgiveness is setting a divine example. God forgiving me and asking me to pass it on. Like last week, we learned that God is generous in his grace. He is also generous in his forgiveness. And he is asking me to partake in generous or radical generosity and also radical forgiveness. When the world tells me you have every right to be angry and I don't blame you for not forgiving that person, God is asking me to forgive, to live a life of radical forgiveness. And my prayer would be that we all enter into the flow of forgiveness, receiving what God has given and letting it pass on to others. Entering into a relationship with God where I breathe in his forgiveness and breathe out forgiveness to others. That is my prayer. Let's pray together. God, as we have looked at